I often hear things online about how super steels and custom knives aren't worth the extra cost over a simpler steel and production knives.
And everything you think is actually at odds with reality when you look at the data.
Oh, there he is.
It's not worth it, sweetie.
And while that may be true for those who haven't actually ever used a knife with a custom heat treatment, dialed in geometry, and high-end steel, but for those who have, it's very hard to go back. Now, I don't want to sound like a steel snob, but when I started to mess around with CPM M4 several years ago, it was one of the first steels I had ever used that was heads and shoulders above anything else when it came to edge retention. This includes production knives in S30V, S110V, M390, ZDP189, and some others. I initially had trouble with it due to warping issues and ended up shelving the M4 projects in the hopes that the warping issues would just sort of go away. So interestingly enough, if you take a warped knife and you hang it on a hook in your workshop for at least 3 years, and then come back 3 years later, your knife will still be warped. So my warping issues didn't just go away, I just figured out what I was doing wrong. This could be interesting. It's always interesting plate quenching a 2100 degree blade. So I'm plate quenching here with chilled plates. CPM M4 is an air hardening steel, but you still need a pretty rapid quench if possible. The plates also help to keep your blade from warping if you do it correctly. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So my previous plate quenching attempts were either done by hand, by simply placing the knife. We're going to pretend this is in a stainless foil packet, but we take the knife and we place it between two plates. And we simply take the plate and press down by hand. That works not real good. The second thing that I tried was to take the plates, and I had this little arbor press set up. You'd have one plate on the bottom. I had a hole drilled here that would go into the arbor, and then you can kind of sort of see what happens. You put the knife in there and then you press down with the arbor press. This was also not a great idea, and let me show you why both of these aren't a fantastic way to plate quench a knife. So what ended up happening was, we're going to pretend this is inside of a foil packet, and this whole foil packet and knife combo is at around 2000 degrees. So you take the knife out, you'd set it on the bottom plate, and immediately this bottom plate would start to suck the heat out of the knife. And then you take the top plate, you put the top plate on, and that foil packet would sometimes have a tendency to push this top plate off of that flat portion of the knife, and you'd actually not be fully in contact with the knife blade itself. Because as this plate sits on here crookedly, it sucks the heat out of the knife at different rates. So you'd have uneven cooling throughout the entire blade. When I did it inside of the arbor press, the same thing would happen because we only have a single point here in the middle. It was very difficult to tell when I put this knife in the arbor press whether or not it was directly in the center of the plate where that arbor press was actually pressing down. So I think what was happening is I'd have this knife in here slightly off center. I put it in the press, I press down, and the press would actually push the plate crooked. And that would cause uneven cooling in the knife blade, and that's what was causing my warps. Now the plate's set up in a vise in this manner. It's much more easy to tell when you have this knife in a foil packet and you place it in here towards the top of the plate, right where these vise jaws are. You tighten this down, it sort of squares itself up perfectly, and it also clamps down on the knife at exactly the same time so that heat is sucked out of the knife at exactly the same rate on both sides of the blade, when you clamp down, rather than putting the knife onto a flat surface first, picking up another plate, and then setting it on top. Ever since I switched over to using this method, I haven't had any warping issues whatsoever. That's not to say that they'll ever rear their ugly head again, but this method works way better than the other two methods. So you can watch this again and see it working in real time. Even cooling equals straighter blades. Now I'm not going to go over all of the details of my heat treating protocol since it may change slightly in the future, but the base recipe is from Knife Steel Nerd's book, Knife Engineering, and data from Crucible. I did do a cold treatment and a high temperature temper, and again, some of these may change in the future due to availability of other heat treating methods. .66. So we are right where we need to be. Now it's back in the oven for 3 2-hour temper cycles. So by the time this knife was done heat treating, we had been running this kiln for almost 9 hours, including the preheat time. We're about 65 HRC. It's probably a little bit harder than I was shooting for. Anyway, we went from a touch over 66 down to around 65 or so. Hopefully it's not too hard. We're going to give this one a test. It's going to be my test knife. It just depends on the what kind of use I put this knife to. It's going to be a test blade, and if we run into problems with the edge being chippy or we snap the thing in half, then we'll bring the hardness down a touch on the next one and give that one a try. Grinding high carbide forming steel at a very high hardness is not fun. Fresh belts is the name of the game. Grinding this knife wasn't too bad since it's a Scandi grind and not near as much material is removed compared to something like a full flat grind, but still nothing about working with this steel is easy. In my experience, ceramic belts are the only belt that really work on a high carbide steel like M4, since some of the vanadium carbides are actually harder than the aluminum oxide abrasives themselves. I've tried aluminum oxide belts on the flats and bevels, and all they really do is make the surface finish look a bit funny, and it will almost burnish the belts themselves. Just some very weird things start to happen when combining aluminum oxide abrasives and CPM M4. The final sharpening was done on diamond stones in a diamond strut progression, and sharpening this really isn't that bad if done on the correct abrasives and you already have a good grasp on sharpening. A quick note here, this knife was sharpened once for this video. And as I'm sitting here talking now, I still haven't resharpened it. And before I made the handle, I did some quick testing to make sure I didn't have any weird chipping issues and the geometry was where I wanted it. It passed everything I could throw at it with flying colors. So this is a test that I do that tests apex stability. Basically a piece of hardwood, take the knife, you twist it into the hardwood like so. This really puts a lot of stress on the apex, a lot of sideways or lateral stress on the apex. And I've had edges chip, certain geometries roll, certain geometries depending on the steel type, hardness, heat treatment, etc. And this is really a hard test for an apex. Piece of hardwood like this, just kind of twisting the knife in the wood. And so far, we don't have any problems whatsoever. So here's the test that I'm worried about. This is the tip strength test. I should be able to stab this lightly into this piece of pine, twist, and hopefully the tip does not break off. This is M4 at 65 HRC. This is a tough test. If the tip breaks off, then we either need to add some change of geometry or we need to soften this a little bit to add a little bit more toughness. Yeah, I guess if we break it, we break it.
He does. He does.
Well, that's good. Well, tip's still there. That's good. I've had knives that stabbed into the pine just like this, very lightly, and they immediately just break right off. And I've had this on video before. It is the video about good versus bad heat treatments. Definitely go check that out. I'll try and leave a link to it in a card up above. But so far, it looks like we're pretty good. And after a whole lot more work finishing the handle, I have a knife that I am really excited about.
I spend my days in despair, for in my mind.
So how much better is a high-performance steel? Well, I can sit here and cut cardboard, trees, paper, you name it, till doomsday and say it feels like it has insane edge retention. But simply feeling a certain way doesn't make it a fact. It turns out these tests have been done before using very scientific equipment like the Ketra test by qualified professionals. And high-performance steels do give higher performance if heat treated correctly.
Somehow, some way, life goes on. I took the good with the bad.
This is my least favorite part about knife making. So one of the big problems with the steel is that it's very difficult to surface finish due to the carbide content in the steel.
I count the days since you've been gone. Somehow, some way, life goes on.
So I'm not gonna lie, it makes me nervous batoning with this knife. But let's be honest, the blade is only 4 inches. It's not gonna baton well anyway. This is a carving knife, a feather stick knife, a knife I combine with a saw, a small axe, or larger batoning knife. Even though CPM M4 is a somewhat outdated steel at this point, it's still amazing with the right properties. Most of the super steels come way too soft from the manufacturers or are given a suboptimal heat treatment due to large batch heat treating. And if you've ever found yourself disappointed in 59 HRC S110V, then you're not alone. Austenitizing temperature, quench speed, cold/cryo treatments, tempering temperature can all play a role in how a steel performs. If this is your comment, nothing against you, you're entitled to your own opinion. But sorry, it's just wrong. I would say it's the complete opposite. There really isn't a modern steel that doesn't perform well at 60 plus HRC, unless it's been heat treated poorly or given poor geometry for the cutting task, as I've demonstrated on this channel before. What these super steel haters think they dislike about a certain steel is actually not the steel's fault. What they really dislike is the heat treatment that's been performed on that particular steel, or poor geometry for the cutting task. And while there's not a huge difference between a good heat treatment and a great one, there's a big difference between a good one and a bad one.
Don't forget your tip.